Hello, welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We are here for tips and tricks for moving to Epicor Kinetic Browser Interface. Our presenter today is Sam Plummer, who is the Epicor Practice Manager at 2W Tech and our go-to guy for everything Epicor at 2W Tech. If you are not familiar with us, 2W Tech is a technology service provider. We are a big Epicor Platinum Elite partner. We're also a very big Microsoft partner, for those of you that don't know that. We have a very extensive line card of products and services. You can visit our website at 2wtech.com to learn more. I'm Sue Brzee. I'm the Director of Marketing here at 2W Technologies and will be the moderator today. We will leave some time at the end for questions. So if at any time through Sam's presentation you have questions, go ahead and send them either through the chat function or the Q&A box at the top, and we'll get to the questions at the end. With that being said, Sam, it's all yours.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, at least if you're in the Eastern time zone. If you're in time zones west of here, good morning, or depending where you're joining from, good day. So yeah, as Sue said in that introduction, I'm Sam Plummer, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about things we have learned working with some of our customers who are making the leap from the classic UI and the smart client into the Kinetic UI and the browser-based user experience. So, and just to be clear, you know, today's presentation is really focused on long-time Epicor 9, Epicor 10 ERP customers who are preparing to move to a Kinetic release, and also as part of that, and really enabled by that, moving their user experience from the smart client and the classic UI to the Kinetic UI in any modern web browser. So again, that's the target. If you're a fairly new, like implemented the Epicor ERP in the last couple of years, you probably don't know too much about the classic UI and the smart client, because most of your experience with the software has been based in the Kinetic UI and accessing it through a web browser. So just kind of setting that expectation up front, I'm really talking to folks that are maybe on a Kinetic release, but still using the classic UI, or at least elements of the classic UI, or folks that are still on a 10.2, 500, 600, 700, or even an earlier release, and are still, you know, firmly anchored in that classic UI as enabled by the smart client. So I'm going to talk about 4 things in today's agenda. First, just going to provide a little bit of background of how we got here. Then I'm going to quickly transition to methodologies and practices that we are seeing our customers who are making this transition be most successful with. And toward the end, I'll pivot very briefly to some technical tips. Again, I'd like to have, you know, more time, and maybe in future webinars, if anybody out there wants to see a deeper dive, for example, into what are some tips and tricks related to, for example, uplifting dashboards from classic UI to Kinetic UI? What about product configurator in classic UI versus Kinetic UI? What about screen customizations and moving code from client side to server side? There's probably 3 topics right there that could easily occupy a whole 30 to 45 minute webinar on their own. So I'd love to spend time on those, but I can't do that on today's call. Again, today's call is a little bit more high level, and I'm going to talk about some things, and hopefully at the end, you know, I'm going to try and wrap up, you know, maybe at 15 minutes before our scheduled end, and open the floor for some Q&A. So without further ado, here we go. Okay. There's a lot on this slide. I'm not going to necessarily go through all the bullet points for everybody's benefit, but I do want to talk about the word kinetic and how its meaning has changed since about 2019. So beginning at 10.2.500, and even a little bit before that, we were starting to see some things that were originally called, I think, the active homepage, and later transitioned to be called the Kinetic homepage. And those were showing up around the 10.2.500 release, which is circa 2019. Oh, Stu, are you able to see the slides okay? I saw a comment in the chat that one of the attendees wasn't able to see slides.
Yes, I'm viewing it just fine.
Okay. If anybody else is having trouble seeing the slides, please note that in the chat. Otherwise, we're going to assume that's a limited issue. But yeah, if anyone else is having trouble seeing slides, please drop a note in the chat, and we'll see if there's anything we can do about that. But thanks for noting that. Anyway, so as we moved into 2020 and with 10.2.700, the Kinetic user interface was essentially in preview mode in 10.2.700, including one of the key tools that we needed to use the Kinetic UI, especially for personalizing and customizing the screens, and that was a tool called Application Studio. So again, that's about 2020, and we were still on the 10.2, 10.2.700 in this case release, but at that time the word Kinetic meant just a style of UI and the tools related to that. As we approached the introduction of what was previously being called Epicor 11 or E11, the Epicor marketing team decided that they wanted to apply that name Kinetic to the entire product. And so what was Epicor 11 became Kinetic 2021.1. And that was on or about June 2021. In the intervening time, we've seen the semi-annual releases, spring and fall, of Kinetic continue to arrive, bringing with them a whole host of improvements, both in the base functionality of the Kinetic UI and also in the tools available for customizing, and specific to this conversation, the tools available to us to help transition and uplift our customizations from classic smart client based to Kinetic UI browser based. And I'll talk a little bit more about those. But the important takeaway here is Kinetic started out as a style of user interface, and today it is the name of the product. But it also includes the description of that type of user interface. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in the next slide. By the way, everybody's probably seen some examples. This slide contains on the left an example of a classic UI form. In this case, it's the sales order entry form. And then on the right side of the slide, the corresponding base Kinetic UI sales order entry form. And again, just wanted to introduce that, although I'm sure everybody on the call has seen this to some extent or another. So a little bit more background, and where are we right now today with Kinetic UI? Well, Kinetic 2023.2, the current release that came out about the beginning of November of 2023, still supports the classic user interface as long as users are using the smart client. And again, I want everybody to clearly understand that you can be running a Kinetic release, including the latest Kinetic release, and still have individual users or individual screens running within the smart client and using that classic UI. And in fact, there's quite a few of our customers today who are in what I would call that hybrid UI experience. Some of their users and some of their screens are in Kinetic UI, and some of their users and some of their screens are in the classic UI through the smart client. Another important point that I want to make for everybody's benefit, if you are exclusively using Kinetic UI screens, the best user experience, as in responsiveness of screens, application behavior, and functionality, is going to happen if the Kinetic UI is being accessed directly through a web browser by accessing the Kinetic application pool URL, rather than launching Kinetic screens from within the smart client. Again, the best user experience is browser native. Beginning with Kinetic 2023.2, again, that latest release from last fall, Epicor brought us a really nice piece of technology to make that hybrid experience better. And that's something called browser first technology. What that allows to have happen is a user running in a web browser in the Kinetic UI, if they access a menu shortcut that calls for a classic UI customization layer, as long as the smart client is installed on that user's PC, and as long as the Edge agent, which is a technical component of the Kinetic UI, is installed and deployed, that user will seamlessly transition from a Kinetic browser-based screen to a classic screen without any, 2 logins or 2 sessions or anything like that required of that user. So again, 2023 is required. The smart client can still be installed, and if you use the Edge client as well, you can use that browser first technology, which means that all of your users, their first login experience is through their favorite web browser. Again, depending on your organization's rules, might be Edge, might be Chrome, might be something else on any OS. But again, if you're going to run the smart client, that client OS needs to be a Windows 10 or Windows 11 OS. Couple more important points as far as where we are in our journey here. Beginning with the 2024.1 release, which is due mid-May, in any case, prior to June 1st, I believe. There's probably an official date out there. I just didn't put it in my slide deck. But by June 1st, 2024.1 will be generally available. And any new ERP features and feature improvements that come with that new release of the ERP will, for the first time, not be backported to the classic UI. So again, it doesn't mean that the classic UI quits working right now or in May or June, but what it does mean is new features and enhancement that require modification to the UI will only be available on the Kinetic UI. So again, this is another gradual step forward in moving that classic UI closer to deprecation. Now, one more commitment that has been made by the product team at Epicor, and that I want everyone here to understand, is that the classic UI and the smart client will be discontinued in the future. We all know this, but the minimum notice Epicor is going to say at some point in the future, the clock is now ticking. There are 12 months before we discontinue that. And again, I don't know when that announcement is coming, but what that means is when that announcement is made, there's 12 months to get your user experience migrated completely over to the Kinetic Browser UI before that next release doesn't support the smart client and classic UI anymore. So with that being said, I want to transition a little bit to what we're seeing at 2W in terms of our customers who are being successful. And exactly when I say being successful, what I'm talking about is 100% or 95+% at least transition of all users' experience completely to a web browser and completely to Kinetic UI forms and screens. Again, that's the mission that we're talking about here, transitioning 100% of the user experience to Kinetic Browser UI. Now, what are the steps that are leading to success there? Well, the first of those is really what I'm calling a technical upgrade. Again, as I said before, it's possible to be running Kinetic 2023.2. I think the latest release is, or update level is maybe 10 or 12 now. I didn't even check before the presentation, but it is critical before undertaking this project to assure that you're upgraded to the latest release and update, and that you continue to take those updates as you proceed on this journey. Because one thing that's become abundantly clear is definitely each new release, and in many cases, each update within a release contains important features and improvements to both the tools and the base Kinetic UI itself that are going to smooth this journey and enable you and your organization to make this transition most smoothly. So get used to upgrades and updates and get them on the schedule, get them planned, get them executed. And as I said before, decouple the Kinetic UI transformation, moving from classic to Kinetic screens, from the technical upgrade process. Now, what is another important preparation step that you can begin taking right now? Begin to organize teams within your organization by department, role, and persona. Again, I'll give one example, but they'll vary by organization. The role of inside sales and customer service, for example. These are the folks within your organizations who spend a lot of time, primarily in the order entry screen, maybe also in quote entry. They're probably all customer maintenance, customer tracker, maybe order tracker, job entry. So right there, I probably named 5, 6, 7 screens that are typically used by an inside sales or customer service role. That would be one of these teams to organize. I want to also emphasize the importance of leadership or a super user within each of those teams. Again, it's two things. The individual you choose to lead each of these teams should be capable of adapting to change and is ready to embrace change. And number two, is willing to help all of their colleagues make that move forward. And again, the most successful teams we see are choosing that super user, that technical leader of the team from within that team. So again, this is not always an IT function, and it's certainly not a consultant function if you elect to use consultants. It's somebody who lives in that world right along with all the other users on the team. The second area of preparation that you can do is to begin to assess the level of customization required within that particular group. And again, we're not looking quote to cash, procure to pay plus financials. We're zoomed down to that persona or department or role of customer service and inside sales, perhaps. And again, we go from looking at hundreds of screens to maybe a dozen or so, and assessing the level of customization using several tools that are available. And I'm naming those here, and I'm going to talk about them again on another slide. One of those is a tool that's available from Epicor. And again, your CAM or 2W can help get you access to this tool, but it's a tool called the Upgrade Analyzer. Again, any of you who have looked at or started or completed a Cirrus upgrade are already familiar with this tool. But the benefit of that tool is it looks at all UBCs, unique business components, customizations, BPMs, dashboards, BAQs, et cetera, and helps to categorize those in terms of complexity and also in terms of their compatibility with Kinetic UI. And there's another set of tools that are available. Unfortunately, they're only available on later Kinetic releases. Again, my screenshots here are from Kinetic 2023.2. Again, I believe these tools have been present going back at least several releases, but they are the configuration upgrade dashboard, which gives you a similar look at what UBCs are present within your system. However, the configuration upgrade dashboard is a native tool. It's on the menus inside of Kinetic. So if you go to Kinetic, search the menu for configuration upgrade dashboard, it'll point you to the screen. You can launch it and you can view BAQs, BPMs, method directives, data directives, et cetera, present in your system. Now, one really, really handy tool that's only become available on the latest Kinetic releases for assessing the level of customization in your system, because the two tools I talked about, Upgrade Analyzer and Configuration Dashboard, tell you what's present in your system. What they don't tell you is who uses these things. And recent releases, specifically, I think this might have become available on 2023.1, but on 2023.2, there's a feature called activity tracking. And in activity tracking, we can actually turn on logging functions within the system that allow you to say, oh, this user just launched this menu item, which calls a custom classic menu form, or this custom dashboard, or whatever it is. There's also activity tracking for BPMs and for custom reports. So again, activity tracking is a super handy tool to help you assess not just what's present in your system that's custom, but what's being used. All righty. So what else are customers doing to help them be successful in preparing to execute a move to the Kinetic UI in the browser? And I think this is a very important one, and it's one you can do regardless of your technical status. Like, even if you're running 905 today or 10.1.500, documentation of your business processes is the starting point. Because if you have a documented process, for example, for sales order entry, at Acme Manufacturing, this is how we enter sales orders. These are the fields you have to populate. These are the optional fields. These are the specific fields or custom fields that Acme Manufacturing requires in our sales order entry process. Without those documented business practices and processes, unique and maintained for your organization, it's going to be much more difficult for you to train and assess and test those business functions in the Kinetic UI. And it's also going to provide a basis for, if we have UBCs, specifically screen customizations, required to support that business process, it's going to provide the basis for analyzing and uplifting those customizations, whether it be user-defined fields or other customizations, for example, on the sales order entry screen, that are required to support your business process. And again, I can't emphasize enough the importance of having those documented business processes. And that's something anybody can do anytime. And it is something that's going to make a big difference in the ease or difficulty that you experience as an organization as you go through these changes. A second excellent preparatory step, especially if your organization is already on a Kinetic version, is to use the learning resources available to you. And they come generally in two categories. One, within the application, and you'll see on my slide right now, on the left-hand side, there's a screenshot of the help and support panel from the Kinetic UI. Again, it's the little question mark by default on the left-hand side, lower left-hand side of your screen. And again, you can open the help and support panel. In this case, I typed in the word navigation, and the first search result returned by the help and support panel was a link to a video called Navigating Epicor Kinetic UI. And again, great starting point for anyone who wants to understand the anatomy of the basic Kinetic UI, the things you can do on the Kinetic homepage, how you use Kinetic menus, etc. And again, Another resource that's available to most customers who are on maintenance is the Epicor Learning Center. And there is abundant content available on the Epicor Learning Center related to this. And I would encourage you, if you have that available to users in your organization, get in there and use these resources now to become more familiar with the Kinetic UI. Now, just a bit of a personal story there. In my case, going back about 3 years ago, we have, I don't know, across our teams at 2W, we have at this point probably 40 some consultants, many of whom go clear back to Vista and Vantage 803 and even some to 6 and 4 releases like me. It's a bit of an uphill battle getting really comfortable and beyond comfortable, what I would call fluent in the Kinetic UI. And I know I personally took about 6 months of concerted effort of saying, I have a choice. I can either open Classic, view Classic Smart Client and do things the easy way, or I can make myself learn how to do them in Kinetic UI. And again, it took me a while to do that. So I expect it'll take others a while too, so keep that in mind. These tools are available. You can start now, and it's not too early. Okay, so let's talk about the specific things that customers are doing. And again, I'm going to stay with that same example of one of the groups. And again, in a typical organization, there might be 6 or 8 or 10 or even more of these small teams, again, focused department, role, and persona. But to stay with the example I started earlier, in the example of our inside sales and customer service department role persona, that group is going to undertake a sprint to get from Classic to Kinetic UI. They're going to work together as a team. They're going to meet as a team, and they're going to move forward together. And what does that process look like? Well, depending on size of that group, a 40-person group is probably going to move a little bit slower than a 5 or a 10-person group. But again, depends on the size of your organization and their ability to work together as a team, which again comes back to the importance of that super user or group lead that I talked about a few slides ago. Depends on them. And it also depends on the level of customization or personalization necessary to support that group. Now, specifically, when we're moving from Classic UI to Kinetic UI, generally speaking, BPMs and reports and the underlying BAQs that might support any custom dashboards, generally those upgrade just fine. There's very few issues with those, but the technical area where we're most focused when we're making the shift from Classic to Kinetic is screen customizations. And again, depending on how heavily or out of the box your particular organization is, and specifically within this team, again, if we're using sales order entry and customer tracker and quote entry and quote tracker generally out of the box, and those are the primary screens, I would say we have a low level of technical uplift required. Whereas if we have a highly customized version of sales order entry, there's going to be some more work for the technical team to do. But this sprint can begin, again, by introducing the Kinetic UI screens to the group with a walkthrough of day in the life. Here's a quote. We're going to turn it into an order. Here's the order. We're going to send an order acknowledgement. Here's the order. We're going to use Order Job Wizard to create jobs. All of those things that we do today in the Classic UI are available to us pretty much on a one-to-one basis in the Kinetic UI. And so very little has changed from that point of view. Now, what is different is the menus, the buttons, the behavior of the UI, and things like that. But by approaching those with a guide, and again, whether that guide is an outside consultant or a super user chosen from within your organization, moving those individuals together as a group is really the first step. Just walk through, including any personalization tools. Again, personalization, I would argue, is even easier in the Kinetic UI than it was in the classic UI. At the same time, while the group, the team, is working on, through repetition, getting comfortable with process, updating process documentation, any necessary screen uplifts from classic to Kinetic and App Studio layers is going to be an activity worked on by the technical team. Again, some organizations have this capability in-house. Other organizations may rely on outside consultants like 2W. And again, in the most successful cases, 2W and client resources are partnering together to also form that technical team. And our experienced consultants are working with your staff to upgrade their skills, specifically on App Studio and the techniques and tools necessary to do this uplift. So again, at the same time, your user team is getting comfortable in the UI, the technical team is working on uplift. As those individual application studio layers that replicate the previous custom functionality become available, they're released one at a time down to the users to test and validate. And in a typical development feedback cycle, if they're finding deficiencies, errors, missing functionality, whatever it might be, they're immediately getting that feedback back to the development team, who can fix those issues, redeploy the App Studio layer, and retest. And so as we move from introduction to comfort level to documentation, this is where we're going through extensive test, document, and train cycles within the team. Again, everybody who uses sales order entry, customer tracker, quote entry, job entry, order job wizard, etc., is getting a lot of reps every week during the sprint on the Kinetic screens. And typically what this requires in terms of time commitment is for that entire team during that sprint, at least 1 to 2 hours per week, and sometimes more than that. Again, focused team meetings together, led by that super user team leader, and with the support of the technical team, including either in-house IT and system analysts or outside consultants as needed, to keep repeating and testing the system and gaining comfort among the team. And then the last step, of course, is for that team to go live. Starting tomorrow, nobody's going into classic UI anymore to do order entry. Starting tomorrow in the live environment, we're doing all our orders in Kinetic UI. Everybody good with that? Yep, let's go. Okay, I'll see you tomorrow. Now, when tomorrow go live day comes, that's not the end of the line. We have to commit as a team to providing extensive peer support. And again, that team leader and the colleagues within that team are supporting one another as they hit a roadblock. Oh, I forgot how to print an order acknowledgement. Somebody show me how. Let's get that. Don't force that user to fall back into the classic UI. Give them the support they need, including the technical team. And if that includes consultants, let's include that in our plan as well. One more note. As I said at the beginning of this slide, it's possible that you may have 6 or 8 or 10 or a dozen teams working potentially in parallel on these sprints. And again, if your team resources permit it, and if the outside resources, whether it's your internal IT and systems analysts, or whether it's your consultants that you're using to assist you, you can have multiple sprints happening concurrently, or they can be overlapped. All right, that was a lot of talk on one slide. I'm going to shift now just for a few minutes to some things specific to screen customization uplift. So one of the things that we're seeing is being reinforced by our experience with some of our customers who are going through this and some who have been successful in completing this journey. Don't miss the opportunity to do the business analysis first. Again, ask the question, what is the purpose of this screen customization? And what are the key functions or features that it enables? And really take a hard look at justifying whether those benefits are whether the benefits outweigh the costs of doing that. Now, in many cases, for example, things we've seen, we've made extensive custom searches available to our users. Again, maybe just in the sales order entry screen, just stick with that example. Well, almost every Kinetic screen has something called a landing page, which is new in the Kinetic UI. And a landing page is a grid-based screen of existing records that comes up. So for example, when you launch sales order entry in Kinetic, the first thing you see is the landing page, which displays a paginated grid of sales orders. Every grid in Kinetic has extensive grid filtering capabilities built in at the personalization level. So again, perhaps if your customization is primarily about searching and finding records, it's possible that you could replicate a lot of that business functionality just by using personalizations on the Kinetic landing page of sales order entry or any other entry screen, in addition to filters in place of searches. Now, another example, the Kinetic homepage and Kinetic UI makes extensive use of things called widgets. And again, if you take the introduction to Kinetic and Kinetic navigation courses that are available, you'll understand what a widget is. But one of those widgets that's available to you is one called a BAQ grid. And a BAQ grid is a quick, easy way to deploy the data resulting from a BAQ directly into a data grid on the UI. And as I just mentioned, built into any data grid, whether it's the one on a landing page or one in a BAQ grid widget that you place on the Kinetic homepage, there's extensive filtering capabilities available at the personalization level. So again, things you might have been doing in the past with dashboards or with advanced dashboard searches can now be done with native tools at the personalization level. So again, don't miss the opportunity to do the business analysis, understand the tools that are available, and look at opportunities to use those tools and to simplify your customization stack as you move forward. Again, as I mentioned on an earlier slide, in terms of planning and assessment, I want to mention that configuration upgrade dashboard, which again, beginning I think at Kinetic 2021.1 release and present and improved thereafter, is present in the Kinetic menu and allows you to see, again, primarily screen customizations, but also other custom objects, report styles, BAQs, dashboards, et cetera, present within your system. And again, if you're on a Kinetic release, activity type and activity tracking can assist you in assessing whether those custom objects are being used. All right, so a little bit more specifically, when we're taking a classic screen customization built using the ICE framework and converting that to an application studio layer, this is the majority of the technical work required to facilitate move from classic to Kinetic UI. And again, if you're using Epicor in a minimally customized configuration, you probably don't have a lot to do here. However, if you're a customer who maybe was an 803 customer who upgraded to 905, who then upgraded to 10.0, 10.1, and now you're at 10.2, 500 or 700, you probably brought a lot of customization along with you. And these are the people I'm talking to now on this slide. So again, being on the latest release is critical. We had some customers who, again, were on Kinetic 2021.1 or 0.2 releases, and were trying and really struggling, even with our help, to uplift classic customizations to Kinetic UI layers. And those early releases of Kinetic, specifically the tools in Application Studio and other upgrade tools, were just not where they are today on the current release. So staying on that current release and always having that current release and update level available and deployed is critical to success here. Now, those of you who have already started to undertake this are going to understand it. There's a lot of moving parts within a screen customization, but the ones that are going to require the most effort are any client-side code. In other words, if you're using C# and link queries in C# code on the client, while that's technically possible to do in some ways in Kinetic, best practices are to take all of that code and move it out of the customization and into server-side objects, specifically either Epicor functions, which have been present since about, I think, 10.2.700. They may have even reared their head a little bit earlier than that, but moving that code to functions or to BPM, method and data directives. And again, functions, method data, and data directives are all server-side code. And as if generally speaking, if it worked in 10.2.500 or 10.2.700, there's very little adjustment required on server-side code, functions and BPMs required to move from 10.2.700, for example, to Kinetic 2023.2. So the sooner you can start moving that client-side code from a customization layer into server-side code, the easier your upgrade path is going to be. One more note, and again, I have a screenshot here at the bottom of this slide. And what I'm highlighting is in the conversion workbench, under the user run conversions, there is an Epicor provided conversion. It's sequence 180 for those of you who are familiar with a conversion workbench. If you have classic customizations present, running this conversion will automatically create an Application Studio layer or a Kinetic UI layer that is essentially the best effort at taking your classic screen and making it work in Kinetic. Now, a few caveats. If your customization, for example, is what I would call a light to maybe moderate level customization, and specifically what might you be doing in a customization like this, you might have added a few UD fields onto, for example, the sales order detail data set. You put a few additional UD fields there, and then you wanted to expose those in the order entry screen, for example, for your users to add additional data when they're entering a sales order. I would call that probably a light to intermediate level customization. Something at that level, again, little to no client-side code in that customization. If you run this conversion program, there will be an Application Studio layer converted, and for example, those form fields and their bindings to the underlying UD fields will be preserved in that layer, and again can provide a starting point for you as a developer in Application Studio to further adjust, behaviors and, kind of layout questions. But again, I encourage you to experiment with this, but this is not the easy button by any means. You can't take a complex customization containing server-side code and, extensive data views and things like that, and just press this button and have it magically translate all that for you. That is not what this conversion does. Again, it provides a starting point for a developer to make that a layer available and begin customizing it for the Kinetic UI. All right, a few other tips and tricks, and then I'm going to wrap up my content here. Specifically, if you have classic UI dashboards, it is possible in Kinetic UI to redeploy, just like you deploy a classic dashboard from the actions menu. One of the actions available on a Kinetic release is to deploy this as a Kinetic UI application. And in this case, what I've done in my two screenshots here on the left-hand side, and I know you can't see the data, but there's a simple dashboard there. The upper data grid displays a list of customers and related data from the customer table. And then the lower grid is subscribed to that with a publish and subscribe relationship. And that displays order header records related to the customer that is selected in the first data grid. Again, simple, standard publish and subscribe. On the right-hand side of my screen is that same dashboard, behaves identically, deployed in the Kinetic UI. And the only thing I did was, again, in the classic UI, launched up dashboard maintenance, opened up my dashboard, went to the actions menu, hit deploy, chose the option to deploy to Kinetic UI, and I got a dashboard that functions equivalently. Now, there's a few things that tend not to work so easily in dashboards. And again, I'm willing to bet these are improving over time. But for example, if you use dashboards using tractor query control, where you have a tractor view and then one or more data grids, those, especially ones where you're selecting a range of values, like a start date and an end date for sales orders, those can be more difficult. And again, it won't be as simple as upgrading the dashboard with the publish and subscribe relationship that I just showed. A couple of tips for that. BAQ parameters. In other words, and if you don't know how to use BAQ parameters, you should learn, because BAQ parameters and dashboards built using BAQ parameters, for example, displaying records between a range of dates is a common use case. Using BAQ parameters is a better and more easily upgraded way to create a dashboard based on that. Also, just in general terms, do as much work as you possibly can in the BAQ, because it makes building and deploying the dashboard in Kinetic UI much easier. All right. Very briefly here, and again, I want to break and get to customizations, but again, what I've done here and displayed on this screen, and again, I don't expect you to be able to see the details, but to understand the concept of what I've done here, on the upper left, what you see is a classic UI customization, and in this case, there's a couple of custom tabs that were added to that classic UI customization, and you can take my word for it, but each of those tabs has a couple of dozen custom controls on it, most of which are bound to UD fields, in this case on the part table. This particular business requirement, there were a lot of attributes related to parts that didn't neatly fit into the standard Epicor fields. What I did with this, again, I imported the customization into 2023.2. I ran conversion sequence 180, and on the lower right-hand side, you see a Kinetic layer that corresponds to this part customization. And you can't see it on my screen grab, but what it did do was created panel cards that replicated the functionality of those custom tabs, including the columns and bindings that were present. So again, it's not an easy button, but it does give the developer a little bit of a head start in terms of taking a classic customization to Kinetic UI. All right. I just want to mention this, and then we're going to go to Q&A. If you are a product configurator, embedded product configurator customer, and you're using product configurators, the latest releases do a pretty good job. Again, they're not magic, but they do provide a starting point. And again, what you would do is either copy or import your existing classic UI configurator. Generally speaking, by the way, your document rules and your method rules should survive this change just fine. The area of focus here is the UI layer. That is the input forms where the user gets to answer questions about, do you want small, medium, or large, red, green, or blue, etc. But again, there is a button, and I've highlighted it here, that any configurator, and this is a we can't go back thing, so don't do this in your live environment, by the way. In a test environment, maybe duplicate an existing configurator, and then there is a checkbox that says Design in Application Studio. And when you do that, what will happen is a Kinetic UI Application Studio layer will be created with all of your inputs and appropriate controls bound to those. It may not look really great, and you'll probably have some work to do to clean that up, but it does provide, again, a starting point to take a classic UI configurator and deploy it for Kinetic UI. All right, so I'm going to wrap, and we're going to get to some Q&A. So, Sue, open the floodgates.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Sam. We actually just have a couple questions. So just a reminder, if you have any questions for Sam, now is the time. Go ahead and send them through either the chat or the Q&A box at the top. First question. We're running 10.2.700, and we have not yet started our journey to the Kinetic UI. About how long should we expect this to take, and what should we budget if we need consulting assistance?
Okay, well, that's a big question, but here's how I break that down. Again, based on the advice we gave here, there's two high-level phases to this, right? Get to the latest Kinetic release first. And again, if you know how to do that, have at it. Get that new environment built, get Kinetic installed and deployed there, and get a copy of your database over there and upgraded. Probably stick it in the test or the pilot slot. That's step one. Then get your organization, again, do a standard technical upgrade. Again, our goal in this phase is not to move any users from Classic UI to Kinetic UI. It's just to get everybody on a Kinetic release, still using Classic UI. And again, depending on where you're deployed, how you're deployed, that might be a couple of months work, and $10,000 or $20,000 to do that if you outsource most of that work to 2W. If you do it in-house, you can estimate that pretty effectively. Now, the second part, moving to Kinetic UI. Again, the two variables in play here are a level of customization. We have extensively customized and barely customized and everything in between. And then, so that's one variable. The second variable is what's your internal level of technical expertise? Do you have dedicated Epicor support in-house? Well, they're going to need to work on getting their skills up to speed. Again, classic customization tools are being replaced by Application Studio primarily. And again, there's a learning path to address there if you have in-house staff. Again, something 2W can assist with. We can work with your team, or your team can go to Epicor Learning Center and get those skills and knowledge and start that process on their own. And then the last step is, once you've gone through those preparatory steps, as we outlined here, start organizing those teams and getting those sprints moving by department and persona. Again, if I were going to zoom out and say, assuming a $10,000 to $20,000 and maybe 2-month budget to do the technical portion of the upgrade, and then assuming a low to moderate level of customization, and teams that are capable with leadership in them of moving quickly, and say 6 or 8 teams doing these sprints, that might add another 3 to 6 months on the end of that technical upgrade. Maybe is another $40,000 in consulting services. Again, and I'm basing that on 200 hours of consulting services. So again, your results are going to vary, but if I were going to pick a middle of the road, I'd probably say somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 months and somewhere in the neighborhood of $40,000 or $50,000.
All right, we have 2 more, so we'll try to get through them before the hour's up. Can I keep using my existing Crystal reports?
Yes, but it's not recommended for a couple of technical reasons. Again, Crystal reports are still supported, and I'm air quoting, but it's been 2W's advice actually since 10.0, 10.1, certainly 10.2, the 10 family, that Crystal reports be replaced with SSRS. Again, can you? Yes. Should you? No.
Okay, great. Last question. How well do custom actions in an updatable BAQ uplift? Normally, the custom actions are exposed to the user through a dashboard customization to put them in the actions menu through the action code itself in the UBAQ's method directives. That was a mouthful, sorry.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one. Thanks for whoever wrote that one. So and again, I would want to bring one of our development team to that conversation. I don't think we've necessarily developed best practices for how to do that. However, a way you might do that would be, again, to add a user-defined field and a user-defined control to the Kinetic UI layer. Again, essentially a dummy field in the data set, and then build BPM code that looks for a change in the value of that dummy field and triggers there. In other words, that's a way to not have to do any UI layer customizations. You've just exposed essentially the dummy field and used a change in value of that dummy field to trigger a BPM, either a method or data directive, or maybe a combination of both to affect the update. I mean, and that's a technique we've used for a long time. There's probably some others, but that's the first thing that jumps to my mind.
Sam, we had a question come in. I'm going to ask it because it seems like it could be short and a few people liked it. So I think it might be a popular question. How do we find out the table name in Kinetics for BAQ?
So if you go to the help and support panel, and I haven't quite memorized this yet, but go to the help and support panel. You may have to click to expand one more layer, and I can't remember what it is, but on the screen, I could attempt to go there. Actually, let's just do that. I know I'm living dangerously here, but that's how I roll sometimes. All right, so let's do this. I think I kept the Kinetic session open. I did. So here's our help and support panel. And I must have something else open because that didn't want to open for me. Oh, let me clean up my screen just a little bit here. Sorry. Okay, here we are. And here's my help and support panel. So I'm going to show you help and support. Click on help and support center. Oh, right. Back box. So you have to click help and support panel, help and support center, and then display field level help. Each one of these question mark, and for example, if I hover over the question mark or click on it for part number, the flyout panel on the right says that's part num, which is what I clicked on. And there's some information of what it's bound to, what the database field, what its format mask is, etc. So hopefully that answers your question. And I feel like I got lucky there because I didn't get too
Great,
balled
thank you.
up in the live
Right.
demo.
All right, I think that's all the questions we have for today. Thank you, everybody, for joining us. If you need a copy of the presentation, please just drop me an email at sue@2wtech.com. The presentation will be up on our YouTube channel later today. Or if you have questions, helpdesk@2wtech.com is always available. Thanks, everybody, so much. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.